Whoa, Calimera, brothers and sisters, or perhaps Calispera, depending on what time of the day you're watching this video. Welcome to episode 2 of the Word with Friends segment on the Mission Zero channel. Today we are going to talk about fear. Okay, so last week I gave you a little bit of homework and I'd like to hear about what you did with that homework. Leave me some comments below and tell me if you actually did anything to step out of your comfort zone. I'm gonna bet that probably the most of you did was listen to a type of music or eat somewhere that you don't normally eat, because those are sort of the most tame of the list that I gave, right? The idea of planning a trip somewhere you've never been, or going to hang out with somebody that you don't really hang out with. That's a pretty intimidating thing, and that's actually why I kind of want to talk about fear today. So to show that my geekiness knows absolutely zero bounds, we're going to start off this story in space. In the early morning hours of August 17th, 1877, seems like a real long time ago, 140 years ago, a gentleman by the name of Asaph Hall. Yeah, that's him there. Doesn't he look a lot like Martin Mull? Anyway, Asaph Hall was a professor at the U.S. Naval Observatory in Washington. Asaph was in charge of the 26-inch refractor, which is like a telescope with a big lens, in Foggy Bottom, which is a fun thing to say. He was in charge of this telescope, and he was using it to observe Mars, our nearest solar neighbor. What he noticed in his telescope around 3 a.m. was an object that was orbiting Mars. And in fact, in the process of documenting that object, he noticed a second object. And he watched these as they orbited Mars several times and determined that these were the two moons of Mars. Well, as all astronomers do, you kind of have to name a thing once you see it. Well, because these two objects were orbiting Mars, Mars is the god of war in Roman mythology. Mars's equivalent in Greek mythology is Ares, right? I think a lot of us know Ares, the god of war, from like Xena or Hercules TV shows. But Ares, in the book The Iliad, loses his son Ascalaphus, and he mounts up two steeds to ride down off of Olympus to Earth to avenge the death of his son. The two horses that he mounts up are named Phobos and Deimos. And so at the urging of a British professor, Asaph named these two moons of Mars Phobos and Deimos. Phobos and Deimos were actually pretty well known to the Greeks. They were more concepts than physical creatures, but when they were depicted as twin boys, small boys, that had glowing red eyes like fire and a wide mouth of sharp white teeth. That sounds pretty terrifying, right? Why would that possibly be a thing that you name? Well, it's because Phobos and Deimos were the gods of two specific kinds of fear. Phobos is god of the horror of war. If you think about a battlefield, if you came to a battlefield where people are dying left and right, probably your instinct is to get away from there as quick as you can. That's what Phobos is. Phobos is the Greek word for fear. Deimos is the god of dumbfounding terror, right? The kind of terror that if you're on that battlefield and you're watching people die around you, will cause you to freeze. And in fact, Deimos is the Greek word for dread, right? And those, in fact, are the two types of fear that the Greek language recognized. Phobos, the fear that makes you run away, and Deimos, the fear that makes you paralyzed. Now, the Hebrews had over a dozen different words, probably closer to 24 words for different types and flavors of fear. And if you want to, maybe someday we'll delve into all of... Yeah, okay. See all these? Yeah, all of those are various words for fear in various languages. There's literally hundreds of thousands of them, right? We've spent a lot of collective time as a species talking about fear and describing fear. But what is fear? At a chemical level, let's start there. I'm probably going to offend a lot of biologists and anthropologists out there because I'm going to condense this really down, and I am not a doctor by any stretch, so please forgive any errors in this. So about 400 million years ago, a cluster of nerves started to develop that eventually became known as a region of the brain that we now today call the amygdala. The word amygdala is actually a Latin version of the Greek word amygdala, amygdala in Greek meaning almond. And in fact, the reason it got that name is because the amygdala is an almond-shaped region of the brain. The function of the amygdala at its core is to process fight, flight, or freeze. Now, as we have evolved and the human species has evolved, the amygdala has grown to also be an integral part of social behavior. The way that it does this is there's a number of inputs to the amygdala, and there's a number of outputs from the amygdala. The inputs are all of your physical senses: smell, taste, touch, hearing, right, sight, but also all of the senses that you don't tend to think about as senses, like your emotions and some of the internal states of your well-being. The outputs of the amygdala are responsible for how you respond, how you behave. And so what does the amygdala actually do? Well, it takes a set of inputs, a snapshot of inputs, and it compares those to previously stored snapshots of inputs. And based on that comparison, it determines whether you should fight, feel affection, feel anger, run away, freeze in terror, right, is responsible for doing that level of processing. And in fact, the amygdala does all of this processing at about 10 times the speed of any other region of your brain that gets those same inputs, which means your fight or flight mechanism kicks in before any other processing can be done. To give you an illustration of this, have you ever had that moment where somebody says something and you think a little bit to yourself, I'm not going to argue that point, but then you do, and you get into that argument, and at the end of that argument, you immediately go, why did I do that? I knew going into that I shouldn't have done that. That was because your amygdala made a comparison and told you to react in that way, to have that argument because you could win, or because it was worth doing, or because it would elicit some other response in the reward center of your brain. And so it pushes you to, in fact, do that. I'll give you another really interesting example of exactly how insidious and subtle the amygdala is in the human brain. I'm going to do this by telling you something that really only my wife has ever known about me. Every night, every single night, before I fall asleep, right as I fall asleep, I jerk. And the reason I jerk is because I have a feeling that I'm falling. And then I go to sleep and everything's fine. This happens to me every night. I'm 40 years old. This has happened to me over 14,000 times in my life. Why does it happen? When I was a baby, my sister desperately loved the idea of having a little brother. She had one rule, which was you're not allowed to hold your little brother unless we are present. Well, one day my parents aren't in the room. I'm falling asleep. She thought I looked cute. She picks me up out of my carrier, and my parents walk in the room. She freaks out and drops me. Now, she only dropped me an inch or two. It wasn't like there was a real risk there. But that set in my amygdala, hey, as you're falling asleep, that's a time when you can fall. And so it stored that. And every single night after that, as I fall asleep, my amygdala kicks in and says, you're falling asleep. This is a danger zone. Feel this feeling of falling so you can wake up and do something to not fall. Think about the level of subtlety of that. It's not like I have control over that. It's not like I have an exchange there, right? It just happens. It turns out your brain actually functions that way a lot. Let's go to a biblical example, right? Most of us are familiar with Mark chapter 8. There's a story where Jesus has his disciples in a room, and he starts to ask them, who do people say that I am? Well, one section of that, he asks, who do you say that I am? And the Apostle Peter, my favorite guy, this roughneck dude, we'll talk about him at some point, but Peter stands up and says, "You're the Christ." Jesus says to him, "No man told you that. The Holy Spirit gave you that." What he's saying, and people never talk about how Peter felt about that scenario, but picture that. Someone just told you that a thing that you just said because you were convinced of it didn't come from you. Peter's reaction, because we know who Peter was, had to be, "That ain't right. No, that was me. I sat here and reasoned it through. You do all this stuff that's like the Messiah. You're the Christ." What Jesus is saying is, no, don't be so sure that the logic you process and the things you know actually come from you. Last week we talked about the word faith, the Greek word pistis, and that the root word of pistis is the word pytho meaning to persuade or seduce. Faith is the product of having been convinced of something. And so what Jesus is telling Peter is, don't be so sure that the things you're convinced of are actually true. And that becomes really, really important when we're talking about fear, because most of us know that fear is unfounded, but we don't really believe that. We aren't really convinced of that. Take anxiety, for example, and think about this in the context of the amygdala. You're feeling anxiety about, your kid goes out to drive to school for the first time and you're anxious about that. You're worried about that. You're constantly feeding a snapshot of that anxiety to your amygdala. At the end of the day, when you find out that your kid is okay, your amygdala processes those things together and says that your kid is okay because you were worried about it. And now that gets stored in your amygdala, who never forgets anything. And every time you stress or you want something to be okay, you'll stress about it. And your brain continues to feed the reward centers to tell you that your stress made that thing not happen. Now, when I say that to you, you know that that's ridiculous. However, let's really talk about what we're convinced of and what we believe about fear and about reality. The reason that many, many people throughout history, millions, if not billions of people across the globe throughout history have had a problem with God has nothing to do with whether they believe in him or not, or whether they like the idea, or whether they can logically get there. It's a trust problem. It's I'll give you an example. You ever been late? You're running late in the morning, and that's the day that every single thing goes wrong, right? You go to brush your hair and the comb gets stuck and pulls some hair out, and your water heater breaks, and you go out to your car and there's a flat tire right there. All this stuff happens that gets in your way, and it's because you were running late. When you hear the words, God directs your steps, or God sets the path of your days, that creates a correlation, probably also through your amygdala, that God causes those things to happen. And so we get things in the Christian community like people say, don't pray for patience, or don't pray for this, because if you do, God's going to give you opportunities to be patient. It's going to be terrible to live through. Those situations, those things feed this belief, feed this convincing that what God has planned for you will suck for you. And so when we hear people say things like, I know the plans that I have for you, plans of good and not for evil, we don't believe that for a second. Or maybe we put that on a different level, right? God's trying to achieve his plan, but his plan is going to be truly miserable for you. Well, we talked about perspective and context last week, and that's really about how you look at it. Right? You can take the position that because you were late, all of this bad stuff started to happen. Or you could perhaps take the tact that all of these bad things happening is an opportunity for you to realize that just doesn't matter. Right? You want to get to work on time, but if you're 2 minutes late, the world the world generally doesn't end. I'm sure there are some bosses that aren't great out there that, you know, yell at people for being 2 minutes late, but for the most part, it doesn't end your world. Those scenarios that you are put through, the resistance that you're confronted with, the diversity that's put in your life is there to shake you out of these wrong things that you're convinced of. It's not just things like, oh, was I the one that said that Jesus is the living Christ, or did that come from God? There's a more ulterior, sinister force there, and that is, you can call it the devil, or Satan, or the enemy of our souls, or any of a million things in various religions across the planet, but the malevolent force of the earth that is corrupting, that we say causes bad to happen. Dive a little bit into why that's not true. That is a tangible entity, and it convinces you of things. I'll give you an example of this. Have you ever stood on like a tall tower or been driving down like the side of a mountain on a narrow road, and you just had that brief, uncontrollable instinct that was like, what happens if I drive off this? Or what happens if I jump off this bridge? That feeling has a term in French, l'appel du vide. And I apologize if you're French, I have a terrible time pronouncing French. But what that phrase means is the call of the void. And so what they're saying is when you have these, what we would probably refer to as suicidal moments, that's actually a call coming to you from, you know, from death, from beyond the grave, from this void that is trying to make you join it. That's pretty interesting to me. I love that phrase. I love the just the lush context of it, because it speaks to exactly and only and exclusively what it is that Satan can do. If you think about the devil in the biblical context, what are we told over and over? He's like a lion stalking his prey. He comes to kill, steal, and destroy. But he has no physical ability. I can talk smack to him all I want right now, and he cannot physically grab form right here and do anything meaningful to me, right? He just can't. He has not that power. What does he have the power to do is call to you at a base level, right? The story of the beginning of Genesis tells a story that I believe says Satan, the prince of this world, has corrupted the mud that we are made of. And I think what that actually means is that reptilian part of us, right? Satan is initially described as a snake. That reptilian part of the brain, which includes the amygdala, gets to convince you to do things and can convince you to believe things. And that is all he wants to do, is convince you of things that are wrong, because those things make you seclude. Right? We talked last week about, things like the Third Reich, places where humanity banded together of one mind to create one rule set, and the fact that all that ever leads you with is an exclusive amount of thinking that tends to excise down to make you a secluded group. Well, if you think about a herd mentality, what's another way of saying that? That lack of diversity segregates you from the rest of the herd. Well, if you think about a lion that's trying to stalk a group of elk, he doesn't dive into the middle of the group of elk. He steers the situation. He shows himself so that they can see him, so that the whole herd will run around, and then he looks for a way to split one off. Interestingly, that behavior in a lion is because the lion's amygdala has told him, if you jump into the middle of that group, something may happen to you that's bad, but if you wait for this other scenario, that's a-okay and you can then attack. That's what the lion does, is it splits off one. And that is all Satan wants to do, is split you off, or the group of you off, away from everyone else, because that's when you're vulnerable. That's when he can attack you. That's when he can call from the void to make you do something, or at least consider doing something that's completely wrong and completely against your will. Well, what can you do with all that? Right? I've talked a whole bunch here about how fear works and what fear is, but what I want to leave you with is something real tangible that you can do about that. If you have a fear, if you have an anxiety, if you have something that's convincing you, or worse, has convinced you that it's not safe to do this thing. You just need to sit at home and watch TV, or you just need to not apply for that job, or you just need to not write that book, or you need to not say that thing, or in my own personal case, for 2 years, you need to not start that channel to talk about something. How do you do that? How can you confront that? I think it is by really, truly understanding what I'm saying here. There is an instinct inside of you that has learned the wrong thing, and you need to teach it the right thing. If you're convinced that you're worrying about your kid driving is what keeps your kid safe, how do you break that, right? You have to take control of that. You have to let your higher mind, which yes, it's going to be slower, right? Your amygdala is going to take precedence, and it's going to make you feel this anxiety, or it's going to make you have this fear, it's going to make you do this thing, and that's your initial reaction. But a few beats later, your higher brain can catch up. And in fact, your higher brain can and does alter the inputs to the amygdala, which means you absolutely can hijack that process. Every actor who ever felt nerves before walking onto a stage, any presenter who ever took a stage to talk to a group of people, they know what that means, to hijack that process, even if they haven't thought about it, right? They overcame that fear. There is a deep and abiding fear in all human beings that says if you speak in front of a large group of people, they're going to ridicule you, you're going to look like a moron, you'll become a pariah, and you'll die alone, or whatever. I don't know exactly what the root of that fear is, but we know what it is to conquer that. And that is exactly how you do it. So I think that's really the key, and that's what I want to leave you with today is take control of that. Hack your amygdala back. Take it by force if you have to, and do that by when you have those responses. Allow your higher mind to kick in when it does, because it's going to, and say to yourself, that's not right. I choose not to have faith in that. I am not convinced that that's true or real or from me. And when you do that, that's what starts to give you control. Now, you may have to do it 10,000 times. It is a process, quite literally, of brainwashing yourself. You were brainwashed into these fears. You have to be brainwashed out of them. And the way that you do that is to confront those things and take them back. I'm not going to feel that fear. My kid's going to be okay. I taught them how to drive, right? Any of these things that you feel anxiety for, just confront that and say, I'm not going to allow that to segregate me. I'm not going to allow that to have control over me. I'm not going to put my faith in something that I didn't tangibly decide, willfully and fully. And then make that decision to confront that fear and to confront that anxiety and to overcome it. Because there is a freedom in that I just can't possibly put into words to express to you. And I want that for everybody. Your homework for the week is tell me in the comments something that you're afraid of and what you're doing to overcome it. Tell me about what you did last week and if it scared you or not, if you did something different and what your experience was. Leave me some love in the comments. Give me a like. If you really like the video, subscribe. I know you probably want to watch me at 2x do it anyway. And I love you all, and God bless you. And I will see you next Wednesday when we are going to talk about something good.